retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. To the interview room, everybody. I've got my board, so we get some music. We're going to need it tonight. Man, oh man, we got a great show for you. We're so grateful that each and every one of you take out your Sunday evening to come over here and visit with us. We love visiting with you, and we hope that this evening will be a really great time for you. If you're new with us, we only ask one thing, and that's if you hit that subscribe button. And then, of course, you share this on all your social media platforms. For that, we would be eternally grateful. And then, of course, our guests are always grateful when you go pick up these two books over here, The New Evil and Killer by Design. And we'll get into that with Dr. Burgess and Dr. Brucato here. We also want to thank our subs, our members, our Patreon members, for without you, we can't do this. And more importantly, as well, our great, great, great mods, Miss Sophia, Teresa M, Maui Girl, and Mimi J2. We love you and we care a tremendous amount about you. So tonight we've got an all-star panel. Once again, our friends are back, Dr. Ann Burgess, Dr. Gary Brucato, and Dr. Victor Petreca. If you've not met Victor, you are in for a treat because he is an extremely, extremely interesting guy and a smart guy. So tonight we're going to be talking about predatorial women. And we're going to kind of, go from the gamut from where they start to, how they end and, is what's in between. And so we're going to hit on Susan Smith. We're going to try to tap into Lori Vallow and others, maybe Blanchard, Dr. Brucato and Dr. Burgess will run by some ideas with them. But before we get started, let me give you their short bios. And their long bios are in the link below for everybody to take a look at. So Dr. Ann Burgess is a renowned pioneer in the assessment and the treatments of victims of trauma and abuse. She is one of the original members of the Behavior Science Unit, and she's the author of Killer by Design, Murderers, Mind Hunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. She is also author of Killer by Design, Murders, Mind Hunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. Did I just say that? Did I say that twice? Dr. Burgess, if you've not bought this book, get over to Amazon, buy this book tonight. I'm telling you, it is a page turner. You're not going to be able to put it down. And below Dr. Burgess is, also one other thing about Dr. Burgess. She is a living legend. In 2016, she was named a living legend by the American Academy of Nursing. And let me tell you this, she is humble. And she's wise and she's smarter than everybody else on this panel. So let's just kind of put that out front before we get started. Underneath her, Dr. Burgess, thank you so much for being here tonight. And
thank you, Chris.
We love it. Okay, Gary Brucato is a visiting scholar at Boston College where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess and Dr. Petreca here on forensic research.
Hello.
They have examined crimes such as murder, including serial killing, mutilation, and dismemberment, and the insanity defense. He studies, among other things, how violent thoughts and actions emerge into psychotic versus non-psychotic persons. He's the co-author of the Columbia University Mass Murder Database, the largest in the world, and he's also the co-author of The New Evil, which, by the way, is in the #1 or the #2 position on Amazon. It keeps fluctuating. So I told Dr. Burgess and Dr. Brucato we're going to get their 2 books in the #1 and the #2 position. So if you've not read the books, Gary may even give us a treat here by going into finding out some of the categories and some of the individuals we're going to talk about. So the emergence of modern violent crime, and we have links to everybody's books below. So please make sure, again, you get down there and check them out. So Dr. Victor Petreca, I always mess up your name, Victor. I am so sorry. But you've a little bit now. It's a disaster either way, and I don't want to keep messing it up. But he's an assistant professor at Boston College, William Connell School of Nursing. He recently got an amazing couple of things happening. I'll let him tell you all about that as we go along. He has an extensive experience in psychiatry, including forensics and personality disorders, correctional health care, psychopharmaceutical and pharmacology, and risk assessments. His research is funded by the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health to explore jail diversion programs, and he works very closely with law enforcement and forensic clinicians to assess and optimize behavioral crisis responses. This man is an amazing human being as well, and extremely, extremely bright. And I'm telling you, everybody, we're in for a treat tonight. We're in for a treat. So as we say here at the interview room, put your seatbelts on, give them a round of applause. Let's see here if I can get it going.
Chris, we've got somebody in the chat here who's giving a shout out to psych nurses. Apparently they're in that profession. So they're expressing joy that you guys are here.
Oh, there it is. I see it. Yay, psych nurses. Okay, I just saw it. Let me put it up here. This is awesome. Yeah. Okay, so while I'm looking for this, there it is, right there. There you go, Just Connie. Thank you, Just Connie. We're so grateful that you're here. And we're looking forward to an amazing show this evening. All right, so there's a gamut here. Am I right, guys? I mean, there is, we've got everything from, Lori Vallow and her kids getting dismembered to Susan Smith, putting her kids in the water to, I mean, it just goes and goes and goes and goes. And so where should we start to maybe understand this phenomena of these types of individuals? And where do you think we should go here at first? Who wants to start us off here with predatorial women? Dr. Petreca, why don't we start with you? Where does the pendulum begin, and how far over does it go? And we'll go from there. What do you think?
Sure. No, that sounds good. I think given the Killer Moms title for the show, it's important for us to define, right, what are the type of killings the killer moms can commit. So the technical terminology that we use for this is filicide. So filicide means when someone kills their own child. Of course, men can commit filicide too, right? And one part that perhaps we should mention is that women commit filicide just as much as men do. And that's not very common, right, for most crimes. In most crime categories, men tend to overwhelmingly represent the perpetrators. But here you're pretty evened out. And then within the filicide, you have 2 categories that we generally consider, well, truly 3, right? But the 2 that we'll be discussing more tonight will be neonaticide. And then the second one is infanticide. So when we are talking about neonaticide, you're discussing someone who kills the child in the first day that they were born. So a woman gave birth and kills the baby within the same day. And just for a bit of reference, what we do from what we know from research is that neonaticide is very rarely associated with mental illness, with psychopathy, and things of that sort. It's usually an unwanted child. So in developing countries, it's often, let's say, a female child that is unwanted because of the role of the male firstborn and whatnot. Whereas in more developing countries, you start seeing the sad mix of a woman who is usually young, who's usually from a lower socioeconomic status, maybe the victim of violence. And then when we're talking about infanticide, those are children who are under 1. There are some authors or researchers that will expand that to 3, under 3 being infanticide. But the motives become much more convoluted there. You can still have some situations in which it's a wanted child, but you also start seeing maybe some of the mental illness coming to the mix, maybe some of the coercion, revenge against a partner, and perhaps more the psychopathic tendencies as well. So many of the cases that we'll be discussing today are probably more in the arena, right? And they might come up today, the idea of homicide and suicide. So that's very rarely in neonatal cases. Those are more in the infanticide cases, usually older mothers, older children. You start seeing the compounding of homicide and suicide. So that just hopefully gives us a little bit of a background and orients everybody to know who we are talking about. And even for those who are more curious, if you see someone killing the first day, right, the baby was just born, that's usually something unwanted. The more extreme cases are going to be the older children.
Okay. Dr. Brucato, Burgess, anything you want to dovetail into what he said?
Well, I think when you start looking really intently at the case, you also want to look at what do they do with the child that they have killed, and the location that they choose, whether it's when you do the neonaticide, a lot of times unfortunately the little baby gets put in the trash or something like that. It really makes you wonder about their thoughts about this child. Whereas if they take the child and then wrap it and put it somewhere else or try to bury it or something. And then we even have cases, I've had actually a couple cases where they don't get rid of the child. No, the child dies, but they necessarily don't. I know one case where she just put the child in the garage, and it probably was neglect or was ill in some way. But at any rate, she kept that child there for quite a while. So that becomes important in terms of the motive or what's going on with the mother. So you have to look at a variety of things, but that's always something that I always look for to see if I can understand a little bit better what they do with the child.
Dr. Brucato?
Well, the way that I tend to think about these things, is very reflected in the scale that Michael Stone and I use in the New Evil, where we shift from situational factors through a wide variety of personality types into people that do things repetitively because of fantasy or personality, right? Cruelty in the personality. And what we're going to see is there's really a gamut of reasons why mothers might eliminate children. On the lower end of the scale are the kinds of things we're talking about, where there are situational factors and stressors. Sometimes we're even going to see that there are traumatic situations that make people act out in that way. And then as we move along, we start to see things like eliminating one's children for attention, or as or getting them out of the way because they're an impediment to some end, like a romance or money, something like that. And then sort of moving up into the really rather rare but awful types of female offenders that can repetitively target children for more serial reasons, more like for sexual assault or living out some kind of horrendous homicidal fantasy. But we will see that those are virtually non-existent in the annals of crime. The other thing is we're going to be concentrating today really on domestic situations. Generally, Dr. Petreca, Dr. Burgess, jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you sort of compare male and female offenders generally in terms of crime, the males tend to be the types that hunt and go out and sort of look for strangers more. And with the females, we tend to see more of a focus on intimates, so that a lot of these domestic cases become more frequent with female offenders. Would you guys agree with that general sense of things?
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Emma, sorry.
No. Go ahead. You start.
I would just expand that a little bit. So for the majority of cases that involve strangers, the perpetrators are indeed male, but even among males, the vast number of victims are still known to them, right? So those are two subcategories that we can look separately. So people in general are more likely to kill people who they know, but in cases when they are strangers, men are generally the perpetrators.
Because it's a projection onto the stranger of feelings from someone they know, like anger at someone who has hurt them in the past or something like that, a prototype that is projected onto a surrogate victim or who is arousing on a sexual level. So I think it's a great point to distinguish. But with this smorgasbord of horrors we have here, Chris, it's hard to tell where we should begin.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start with let's start with Susan Smith. Are you guys comfortable with that one? And I've got this video that I had done a while ago that I think will bring everybody to the location of where this thing went down. And this is from one of my other videos, but I thought it would be interesting for us just to kind of follow a little bit here, kind of do a stop, start, play, and get your comments on it. So this is the lake in South Carolina where she actually drove the children into the water. And maybe you can, with any information you may have in advance, Gary, about some of the work you guys have all done actually on her. Do you want to start there first, and then I'll start the play here, or what?
Well, I mean, it's important to understand that in the Susan Smith case from 1994, what you were really dealing with is a person who went out of her way to create a very public drama surrounding the loss of children, with a lot of crocodile tears and getting in front of cameras and so forth, and used this narrative, told this story that she was stopped at a traffic light with her children in the car, and then an African-American man sort of pulled up beside them, carjacked the vehicle, and then ultimately was responsible for abducting the children. It was sort of a phony abduction story. And it's important to understand that it ultimately became clear that the motivation was that she was interested in a romantic connection with a man named Tom Findlay, who did not want children, had written her a letter saying that he didn't want to be with someone with kids. And then when this vehicle is dredged up out of the water, this note from him is in the car with the children. But you really want to understand the premeditation involved here. And we're going to see the lake there. You have to picture that, as I understand the crime, she watched as that car sank into the water and heard the children screaming for her, making a commotion.
So here we are.
Right. So you really want to get this in your head, this idea of this is somebody who in a cold-blooded way plots this, does this, and stands and watches it, and then goes home and pretends that she's heartbroken alongside the husband. They both are put under lie detector. She fails, he passes. The story gradually deteriorates, and then we wind up with this horrendous story. So this is really quite a case.
Yeah, and this is the boat.
Mom jumps out of the vehicle, and that car goes down this steep incline, which you can see here, gains enough momentum to where the vehicle is gaining enough speed to hit this water. It initially goes out about 30 feet, floats another 30 feet, about 30 feet, they said, and then subsequently sinks. But here, not only is that horrifying to be thinking about and terrible, I can't even comprehend it. But she's standing right here watching the whole thing go down.
Okay, I mean, that in of itself, help us understand the math on that internally for somebody, right? Even if Dr. Burgess, what say you on this one?
Well, what I say on this one is I'm fascinated that drowning or water is really the method, if you will, because we often don't necessarily see that. But as we're doing some research that both Gary and Victor and I are involved with, drowning seems to be something. So to first look at that, you want to look at, well, how did this happen? Well, the drowning, how did she think of the car as doing that? Did she read about it somehow? Or, I mean, that's a rather unusual kind of way to say goodbye, if you will, to your children. And that had to have been thought about clearly and to know that that was going to happen, because what if it could have just stalled at the edge of the water, and then what would she have done? I mean, there are a number of if only something else had happened, but that she knew that water was going to engulf the car, I think is rather remarkable. And I think it speaks of the cold-blooded, as Gary said, the cold-blooded intent there to be able to do something for another purpose, that this new boyfriend or this other boyfriend, that she could kill her children as a way to eliminate, as Gary can get into these elimination kinds of cases, certainly takes, where does that come from? And I think when you look at some of her background, it is quite interesting what you might suggest threw her into this type of situation.
Dr. Victor, anything you want to add on to that?
Well, I think that considering the age that the children were, that would be important, right? Because here we are dealing with an infanticide type of scenario. Those are children who, although one of the youngest one was 14 months, right? So the motivation that we start exploring is a little bit more heterogeneous. We start looking into, is this person potentially mentally ill, which is often a question, right? Especially defense. We always try to bring that as a potential defense. Or is this someone who perhaps has other motives, whether they are pragmatic, whether they are practical? One thing that, to echo Anne's and Gary's comment, is to stand there as anybody, right, is drowning, even more so your own children, and be able to flip the script after the fact and essentially put on into this, I'm a victim, the damsel in distress, right, if you will. It requires a certain personality archetype to be able to do that, a certain detachment, right, and a certain level of just self-interest. And here I'm sure we'll be discussing a bit more what potential self-interests were, and I don't think it's a mystery, right, for everyone, that there was the other gentleman in the picture that may or may not have wanted children and potential relationships. So that gives us pretty good glimpses into what this person's view of the world and other people are.
Yeah.
Gary, anything?
Well, I think it's instructive and interesting to compare the Susan Smith case to a very recent case from last month of a woman living about 25 miles away from Dallas in Texas named Wei Fen Ung, if I remember the name correctly. And what happened there was that apparently, due to some domestic issue or some emotional issue, she stabbed her husband, put the 3 children into a car, they were all under 13, and drove them into a lake near Dallas. And everyone survived in this situation, but it was compared on the news. I mean, I was on a program where where in the block just before they were making a comparison between these offenses. And I think it's instructive to think about how an emotionally driven, impulsive offense is very different than one where somebody plots for days and then can do something like this. So that's where you start getting into this detachment that Victor is talking about, that requires this ability to sort of put things into compartments or boxes psychologically, that is very different than a person who is flooded with emotion, picks up a weapon, stabs a husband, piles the kids in the car and rams, plows the car. And incidentally, here's a big difference. In the Ong case, she was in the vehicle. It was an expression of hopelessness. She went into the water too. What we see in the Smith case is that she leaves the vehicle, and takes the emergency brake off so that the vehicle rolls in. And to top it off, as another sign of premeditation, makes certain that the children are strapped into their car seats so that there's no chance that they're going to, unbuckle and, or float to the surface or anything like that. I was very interested in the video that you just showed, by the way, seeing the people taking the pictures, because it's the first time I realized the depth of the water. Are they just standing with their feet touching the bottom of the lake where the car is, or are they swimming? Because I've always wondered how deep that water was with that car. Because you see,
this is the actual.
when they're snapping the photos, it looks like it just kind of comes up to their necks.
Yeah, this is the actual prosecution video, the reenactment that they played in court.
Goes down this steep incline, which you can see here.
This is exactly
Gains enough
the way they
momentum
believe, and those are divers.
to where the vehicle is gaining enough speed to hit this water. It initially goes out about 30 feet, floats another 30 feet, or about 30 feet, they said, and then subsequently sinks. But here, not only is that horrifying to be thinking about and terrible,
I can't even particularly deep. It doesn't. I mean, Anne and Victor, doesn't it look like they're just standing in that water?
Yeah, they are, but it actually goes out and then it drops.
Yeah, and I wonder if she knew that, because they that car could have just stood there, or without getting any water into it. So I wonder if she knew that there was that drop off, because when National Center was trying to help locate the child, because they knew that the children were, they said, is there a body of water nearby? And actually, obviously there was. So she had to have had some understanding, or maybe that was a place that she had been as a child herself. We know that killers often commit the crime in an area they feel comfortable in, or they have some kind of attachment to. So that should have been obviously asked on interview with her after she was arrested to see if it was. I don't know anything more about it, but
well, there's also the fact that for somebody trying to perpetrate a crime, to eliminate these children and then go off and have a relationship, and with this cover story that somebody abducted them, it was rather foolish to leave the note in the car, which points to the boyfriend, to Tom Finlay, the love interest. And there has been this question in my mind for a long time of whether that was just foolish, or represented a kind of arrogance that no one would ever find the vehicle, or if it was some symbolic thing that that the children were connected to this rejection, and that's what So it's I think that's something that is worth contemplating, because for a perfect, brilliant plan, it was rather goofy. She didn't really think it through very well, it seems to me. But
it's really interesting. I mean, there are children today. I mean, just last week we talked about Summer Wells and how the sheriff has come out and said the family is not cooperating with the investigation. And if we go back and we look at history as for lack of a better term, I mean, she really came up with a doozy. To your point on the story, and let's listen to what she said back then in her very first press conference.
Your mama loves you so much, and your daddy, this whole family loves you so much, and you guys have got to be strong, because you are. I just know, I just feel in my heart that you're okay, but you got to take care of each other. And your mom and dad are going to be out here waiting on you when you get home.
It hurts to know that that I would be accused or even thought that I would ever do anything to harm my children. As a mother, it's only a natural instinct to protect your children from any harm. And the hardest part of this whole ordeal is not knowing if your children are getting what they need to survive. And it hurt. It hurts real bad.
So, I mean, here we have a situation where, I mean, she's just gaming the entire world. What's going on there from your guys' perspective, Dr. Burgess?
I just wonder. I think I don't know if I don't think people commit a crime and think they're going to be caught. I think they commit a crime and don't want to be caught or don't think they'll be caught. Now, imperfect as that is in terms of their thinking about it and so forth, that she has to, at least in the interview that you can see that was on television, is she talks about how sad she is, but there are no tears. I don't think that she is not able to generate any kind of tears, but she thinks she's going to get away with it. Is there a like a psychological response to the central nervous system that prevents the tears from coming in the human condition? Well, I think there is, right. Tears usually come when there is a physiological response and an emotional response. And if you don't have it, how can you have tears? So I think that's always a good thing to look for. It's very hard. Now in movies and so forth, they put stuff in their eyes to make them have tears. But I don't see that happening in any of these TV shows or the interviews kinds of things. But she couldn't generate. How could she generate tears if it didn't match the emotion? Interesting. So there has to be, in order to get that response, there has to be an emotional connection of some sort. Yes. Unless she has an onion in her pocket or something like that. The only other thing I can think of would generate some tears. Dr. Burgess,
it is interesting, Chris, to think about that. The idea is that Susan does reportedly have a history of trauma, and trauma can blunt the effective reaction of people. But like, for example, when Susan was a kid, she lost her father, she was pretty young, and he committed suicide. And then when she was 13, she attempted suicide. I always thought that the abandonment feelings related to the father were related to why she was so terrified about losing this love interest. So there's that same outcry of, I cannot handle abandonment. Without this overwhelming emotionality. And one wonders if she developed a kind of system of compartmentalization emotionally for coping. And also there were accusations of her having been molested. By the man that the mother married after the suicide. That was an accusation that was made at the time. So I think we also have to understand, like a lot of these people, particularly female offenders, that have this capacity of compartmentalization, elimination, of children, things like that. A lot of them have experienced victimization. And when we talk about Susan Smith, I have noticed when people discuss her that there is a tendency to overlook or minimize her own history of abuse. And I think, Victor, I think you're somebody that really likes to draw attention to this extremely important factor in the life. I mean, and this is not intended to create an excuse by any means, but I think when people like us are studying why these offenses occur, it's really important. I mean, the data is the data, and it does come up. I mean, Victor, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I would just add that trauma history or not, right? The vast majority of people, period, go through traumatic experiences and don't end up exercising violence or aggression towards others. And it's true that among perpetrators in general, we'll have a high rate of victimization. It's in fact one of the largest risks to become a perpetrator is being a victim, vice versa, right? But you're not looking at necessarily causation there. So I think it helps to perhaps understand a little bit more how her psychological makeup evolved and got to be to this point. But it doesn't excuse, right? Or perhaps it offers an explanation of some sort. But then there's also the question that this person probably had other factors that predisposed them. And sometimes we know that there is personality disorder traits that are inherent, that there is a genetic predisposition, but then you have to have something that is going to occur at some point to trigger those. And then just to connect with Chris's point earlier about the tears, I agree with Anne that is rather unusual, whether it's tears or not tears, but some type of affective reaction, right? Because people mourn and they grieve in different ways. But once you get this, I wouldn't even say that it's blunted, it's just even, right? Because oftentimes when you see someone who is so shell-shocked because of something that happened, it's not that the effect is even. And when I say effect, it's what you're seeing in this person's face, right? The emotion. It's just like non-existent. It's the absence of emotion. And when I see her, I don't know if I would say that I see an absence of emotion. I see just a very even-keeled, peaceful emotion. It's someone who is asking someone to pass the butter. It's not someone who's like, the lights are on when nobody's home.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I picked up, when you show both of them sitting on the couch, you see the father that's looking, he looks so in shock. He just sits there, where she's the one that does more of the talking and so forth. Yeah. Technically the father is equally victimized by the loss of his two sons. I want to also say one thing about her history and what came out at the trial that I was rather interested in. This was, even though it was a stepfather, it still is considered an incest case. And he got on the stand and admitted that they had a sexual relationship starting when she was quite young as an adolescent, and even was ongoing up until that time, whenever that happened. And I thought that was rather remarkable that he did get on the witness stand and admit to that, and said that he shared in some of the blame, that she wasn't totally at blame, that he shared in it. I'm not sure if that's exactly the way the testimony went, but I do remember back at a time when incest was something that people just didn't believe happened. And yet he was able to talk about it. So it's a very interesting case, and the dynamics, I think, are critical to look at. And if anyone has gotten online to look at, I think I'm not sure she's getting ready to be released, but there is information about her having correspondence with other men. I'm not sure if they are also in prison. There's something about along the line of 6 other men. So her need, I think Gary spoke to this, her need to have a male in her life, not only one, but looks like 6 at the time, certainly speaks to some personality factors that either Victor or Gary are more than able to deal with and talk about.
Well, I also think that you have a situation, because I like to sort of imagine myself into scenes, and we have to picture that when she's a young adolescent, her stepfather is in a sexual dynamic with her under the mother's nose, and she has to be something of an actress. Even from that age, to conceal it, this idea that, dad and I are having a dynamic right here, and no one knows about it. She must have honed an art of pretending that she was good at. And I think that just has something that kind of gives me the creeps when I think about it. Also, when I look at the that video of the husband holding her hand and so forth, perhaps it's a projection of mine, but I look at his face, his heartbreak. Remember, he passes a lie detector test about this. She doesn't. He's truly heartbroken. And you look at him, you almost wonder if on some level he suspects it, that she's lying, and that's part of the horror of all of this. But for me, this falls under the umbrella of what I've been calling for some time now, elimination murder, where for one reason or another, you've got to get someone or some people out of the way because they're an impediment to something. And I think that's sort of what this is. She, and that, I think, Victor, you'd say, correct me if I'm wrong, with all of the traits that Susan Smith seems to have, one of them is this ability to use people in an objectified kind of way. Isn't that, I think, really central to her personality structure?
Yeah, and I think to the crime that we are looking at, right, that is very practical, is very pragmatic. So it serves a very clear purpose, right, at least based on the information that we have seen over the years. And then we have to also think about the social context, right? This was back in the 90s, but this kind of persists to these days. And everybody, I'm going to say this, there's evidence supporting it. Women are sentenced much more leniently than men are, period. Even if you have the same charge, even aggravating factors controlled for, you have harsher sentence for men than women. And in the case of filicide, for instance, about 3/4 of men who are charged with filicide, they are sentenced to prison, oftentimes life sentence. And about 15-ish% of women are sentenced to prison. The vast majority, they are civilly committed or given some type of psychiatric treatment, even if there was no mental illness. And this has been called in the literature as the chivalry justice, right? That there is this assumption that socially we just, I guess, accept I guess I would put it this way, that the chivalry justice talks about how, based on our social makeup, we perceive femininity being incongruent with violence or aggression. So it's much easier for us to digest and just accept that a woman causes harm. She was either victimized, she was either trying to protect herself, or she was mentally ill. When there are women who commit crimes for their own self-serving reasons.
Well, there also
Interesting.
a cultural factor where it's changing. That the reasons why women offend are more recently looking a lot more like the reasons some men offend, which is, when you lay it out by decade, has to be cultural, because it's increasing. And that's a whole other topic we could get into. But I did want to say very quickly, because Anne and Victor, I'd love your thoughts on this. But as I recall, the defense that was used at the time of this case was that this was really a botched suicide attempt, that she wanted to die also, and that she was emotionally unstable. But I think the fact that she gets out of the vehicle and watches that car go down ruled that out. I mean, I'm just curious, Victor and Ann, is there any weight whatsoever to that kind of defense that was used, or does that just sound like nonsense?
Well, if I remember the case, didn't she, right afterwards, she ran to somebody's house, and that's when she starts screaming.
Right.
This man came up I was at a stoplight, and I think they went and found that the stoplight was like blocks away.
Here it is, right here. This is the area. She said it occurred right in front of this grocery store. It's being torn down now, but he went to.
This gives a full written confession after 9 days to the police investigators in the case that she killed her young boys. The news shocked the world.
So right here over to the right is where Susan lived.
This is her house.
Well, she and her husband bought that house. The two little boys were there. And this would have been the road that she would have taken to the park. So let's take that drive together, shall we?
So what I found fascinating about this drive, this is her house, middle America. But what I found fascinating about this drive, and I'm curious of what you think, is what's going through her head. There are multiple stop signs coming up that, it was almost like this messaging just kept coming at her. She passes a couple of churches. There's just so many, things happening. I thought while driving this, and it's not a far drive to the area where she's headed, but she realizes that both of those children are strapped in their seats right behind her. And she's going to get up to, hang on for a minute. Sorry about this. I don't know where that just came from, but I'm going to skip it. Here it's the drive now towards the park. It's not very far from her house. she's got to be thinking, I'm doing this. This is going down today. What do you think?
And she's
Watching
probably
that.
telling the kids we're going to go to the park.
Yeah, and now this is the approach to the park. As you can tell, it's not very far at all, to get to this place. And if you want to watch the whole video on this, you can go over and watch it. It's under Susan Smith. But when I go ahead, Em.
Where's the light? She says it's at the light.
Well, this is what she said, but there are no lights.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And so this is the turn now into the park.
Right.
This is the route that she took.
So I think Victor and Ann would agree, and correct me if you don't, but I don't think that we see a lot of the signs we would see in a desperate, suicidal, emotionally overwhelmed person that didn't think there was going to be a tomorrow, where you're, plowing the car at high speed, blowing through stop signs, just driving the car into the lake like a maniac. I mean, there's nothing like that. This looks like the behavior of a person trying to look calm and composed and just get there and do this.
Yeah, and here,
which I think speaks to the premeditation, but also the bone-chilling detachment from what was about to happen. And I agree, Anne, that image of her talking to the children, reassuring them, possibly maybe saying goodbye to them, adds a horror to this that I think we don't really want to think about, right? I mean, strapping them in, the whole thing, and did she kiss them goodbye? Did she, it's really disturbing. Yeah. But what do you guys think about, do you agree we don't see the disorganization, the signs of erratic behavior you would see in somebody who's deranged?
No. Yeah. And I think that aside from the actual moment, right, the before and the after are important when we are exploring something that is more impulsive or maybe associated with mental illness and whatnot. Because yes, it could be someone who is driving the car and is perhaps in a state of mind that is erratic, but right. I agree with you that sounds pretty unlikely considering the trajectory that you showed and how it got out of the car goes down and so forth. And I guess the caveat that makes you wonder, because such a poorly conceived plan, right, that makes you wonder if it was impulsive to a certain extent. But she, as far as we know, at least, she doesn't seem to be a very experienced person when it comes to committing crimes, right? So that can oftentimes be a possible explanation to why the plan was so weak, right? They don't have any stepping stones to honing their method.
Victor, is it odd she got 30 years with parole? I mean, she's up for parole in November.
Yeah,
is it odd for killing your children?
So again, it's one of those situations, right? That once you start seeing the sentencing structures, how female versus male perpetrators are approached. And it is true that there are some cases in which you have female perpetrators who would receive more extreme sentences, but those are the exceptions, right? Because it's like if we put a woman in a pocket that we cannot explain her as having the victimized person who became this or the mentally ill or whatever, then let's just make her the worst witch in the planet that is an anomaly, and let's just hit her as hard as possible legally. And we have seen laws, specifically, there's 20-something countries, right, that have laws for infanticide that treat the crime as manslaughter by definition. So that in itself kind of shows how the legal system approaches. And as we've seen some of this wax and waning, in average, women are going to be receiving the sentences that perhaps wouldn't be as harsh as if he was a father, for instance.
Well, my mentor, Michael Sohn, has always told me that he wonders if some of these cases involve judges who take into consideration the woman being too old to have any more children, that she's gone through menopause, so that even if you let her out, she can't have any more children and couldn't do this again. You know, he thought, for example, when they paroled Mary Beth Tinnig, who was a woman that had repeatedly killed her children, that reported that it was due to, you know, viruses or shaken baby or whatever, and it turned out that she was killing them for attention. When they let her out, I remember Michael saying, well, she can't have any more children. The judge probably took that into consideration. And I wonder, Ann and Victor, any possibility there's truth to that? I mean, do you think that's something that they weigh?
Yeah, no, and there's evidence that supports that notion as well, because, and that ties in, when you see older mother, older children, that's usually when statistically you see more of the postpartum psychosis, depression, and the mental health defense linked to it. So once you put all those things together, then you start thinking, all right, this woman is offending only in the context that is biological, right? So in the biological issue in the picture, that she will never offend. But the thing is that there's not sufficient biological evidence supporting, right? So I think at some point we talked about the lactation insanity, right? Or whatever it was 50-something years ago. But that kind of still permeates the legal system, the idea that, okay, now that she cannot bear children, she should be safe to society. And I don't know, I still lean towards the idea that if one is capable of harming one, why wouldn't it be able to harm another?
Well, it gets into this point of why the motive is so important, because if it's personality driven, there could be different dynamics that provoke the need to eliminate people. Doesn't have to be one's children. It could be, but which is where I think it's important to distinguish it from someone who's motivated by desperation or biological factors, mental illness. It's a very different situation. You know how it is, Victor. You know, when forensically trained people go in and do like mitigation cases and crimes and things, they have to think about situational factors and stuff that can make it, that could prevent if this was going to happen again, if the factor wasn't present. And but I agree in this case. I think it's so clearly her personality that it would be hard to believe that not being able to have children is going to make a difference. By the way, I think she was born in 71. So if she is paroled next year, you know, that does we likely place her post-menopause. I don't know what I have to look what the average age is for menopause, but I think it would place her post-menopause, and that may figure in. Which I think would be very controversial, but an interesting idea.
Well, she's coming up for parole. This is her first parole. They don't usually give you parole on the first try, do they?
Well,
Chris, do you know?
No, I mean, I think she's been up a couple of times already, and I think what sunk it for her the last time, she ended up having some type of relationship with one of the guards.
She could have gotten pregnant during her whole jail time, prison time. Don't forget.
That's a good point.
If you want to believe everything in the paper, and I read that too, Chris, it wasn't just one guard, it was several guards. But don't you think that, here we are thinking, oh, this is awful. She's got to be thinking of saying goodbye to her kids and et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking she's just sailing along saying, this is that perfect fantasy that she's going to get this young man and that this will take care of it. I don't think that she has the emotional input to be thinking about her kids. And she took a chance. She could have been out there other times and there could have been another car there. There could have been things that it isn't unusual for either homicidal or suicidal acts to get be a barrier thrown up and they can't go through it.
And one of our audience here has a question, but she's going to throw us a curveball about Casey Anthony. Gary, you have some. What she's curious about your take on Casey Anthony. Where does she fit on the scale, Gary, in the book?
Well, it's complicated because this is not a situation where somebody is found guilty. I mean, we can't really, it's not a situation where we have a confirmed crime and then the person reveals the motive. I mean, we only know what was speculated about, right? That, and what was speculated about was that this was an elimination situation where you basically want to get rid of someone to have a lifestyle where you're not saddled by a child. And this is something that comes up with a few of these cases. There was a case, for example, of a woman named China Arnold, who had a boyfriend that didn't want a baby. But she didn't just eliminate the baby with smothering or something like that. There was an excessive degree of cruelty because she eliminated the child by microwaving it. That was one of the three I have on record of microwave murders. And then they tried to defend her by saying she had an epileptic seizure during which she accidentally put the child into the microwave. Now, I guess what I'm getting at is the excessive, unnecessary cruelty is where it starts revealing things about a personality that go well beyond the need for elimination. And that's what you want to think about when you're thinking, is this personality disorder? Is this desperation? Because one of the things it would be really interesting to touch on is when desperation is involved, you see the sensitivity and the love of the children, even in the elimination of them. You even see things sometimes, and aren't there even cases of things like covering the child after killing the child, holding the child, cradling it, putting it under a blanket, putting it in a loving location, etc., which I think has to be compared to something like using a microwave unnecessarily.
Sure. Andrea Yates wrapped her children and put them back to bed.
Right.
After she drowned them.
Right. Exactly. Which I think has to be distinguished. If you have a spectrum, Andrea Yates, who's somebody motivated by psychiatric illness, is very different than somebody with the cruelty to do something like that with the microwave.
Right.
And then, of course, we have the Casey Anthony question, right? Did you guys have thoughts on the Casey Anthony thing? Obviously this is somebody found not guilty. We shouldn't be. Yeah.
Well, she did a lot of research on the internet, so they got her hard drive and were able to analyze what she had been looking at, and I think that tells a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, Victor, did you want to say something before we
migrate
here?
I feel more comfortable commenting on the Yates case because that has a legal decision, right? But I think the point that Gary brought up is an important one because it's quite bizarre, right, if you will, to wrap around and put that babies back in bed and things like that. And usually we are looking very carefully at those signs when we are trying to rule in or rule out the insanity defense, the presence of a mental illness. But most importantly, in the Yates case, there was a very well-documented history, right, of pre-existing serious mental illness that preceded everything. So those historical components are very important in addition to the after. Oftentimes, in some cases, people just look, in this moment in time, in this 20 minutes, the person was mentally ill. It's like, well, it's not quite like that, right? There's the before and the after that needs to tell the story.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Before we do our transition here into having just a brief discussion about Lori Vallow, how she fits into this, Gary, with your book and your scale, do you have it there by chance?
Yeah, I can get it. Hold on.
All right. I'm going to ask him I want him to read his assessment where he would put Susan Smith.
I don't need the book to do that. I could read it. I have it here if you.
I know.
But I'll tell you that I put her in category 10. Michael and I put her in category 10. Yeah, and categories 10 and 11 are for people who kill to get people out of the way, right? All that I love.
And make sure you get Dr. Burgess's book, please.
Yes, that's
Killer by Design, Amazon. Yeah. We got to push her to number 1. And Gary, between the two of them, we get 1 and 2 on Amazon. Okay, so she's number 10. While he's looking that up, Dr. Burgess, my understanding there's a special show coming.
Ah, yes.
On Hulu.
On Hulu, that's right.
What can you tell us?
Yes. Well, they actually have some of the beginning, whatever you call it. There's supposed to be a series of 4 docuseries, and it's going to trace the how I got into with colleagues into this whole area of victims and offenders, and go back to when this was just being talked about back in the 70s. And it's fascinating what they've got, and they've rounded up all these old newspaper headlines that really make the point about where we were at what, 50, 60 years ago. So that's coming up sometime in 2024. I don't know when it will be, but we certainly will let you know.
And do you think your two colleagues on this potentially could be involved in any way?
Oh, I think they both are. They've both been interviewed.
Yeah.
Right? Victor and Gary both were interviewed.
Yeah.
I don't know what they were interviewed on. I don't know what they said.
Okay. Do you know the name of it yet? Do we have a name? Do they have a name for it, for the series?
The working title is Mastermind.
Mastermind. Wow. Okay, everybody, you heard it here from Dr. Burgess herself. And now you know why they do books and movies and shows about her life and others. And now we've got all three hopefully will be on the program. Thank you for sharing that. We're very grateful for that.
Is somebody playing you, Anne, like in flashback sequences or something?
I don't know.
Well, they've had other actresses play you on other shows, right?
Oh, I'd love to think about who they would use to play Anne. Victor, who would play us? I wonder. In this story, I want Mark Ruffalo. How about you?
Well, how about if we ask our audience who should play Victor and who should play Dr. Brucato and who should play Burgess? Put your answers in the chat. Put your answers in the chat, everybody, and let's see what names we come up with. Okay, here we go. We're gonna our modest Nicole Kidman. There you go.
There you go.
And
fantastic.
I like that one.
Armin Asante. Let's see here. We got to get some more. Keep adding them here. Let's see here. Mark R for Dr. Gary. Who's Mark R?
Mark Ruffalo is an actor that I like a lot. Yeah, I
Okay.
always joke that I want him to. He can play me. Victor, I don't know on you. I'd have to give that some thought.
Oh, here's one for you, Gary.
Oh,
Nicolas Cage.
Nicolas Cage. Wow.
pretty good.
Wow.
Pretty good. Yeah.
That's not so bad, but very, very funny. We're getting the funniest comments here, though. This is a trip.
Oh, Susan Sarandon. Yeah.
Yeah, that's for you,
That's
Ann.
not so bad.
That's for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
Good.
This is for Victor.
Well, let's see.
Victor Grace.
That 70 show.
Victor, they're saying
Denzel
Ben
Washington.
Affleck.
Oh, that's what I was hoping for.
Dr. Brucato himself. How about that?
Oh, yeah.
How
All
about
right.
that?
There you go. Inimitable.
Awesome. Well, that's fun. Okay, so let's get back to the book. What do you got for us, Gary?
Well, the description for Category 10 just says, individuals in Category 10 do not necessarily harbor specific ill will towards those they kill. Rather, they are motivated to eliminate them simply because they are in the way. A victim might have known too much about one's past, posed a burden, or constituted an impediment to some selfishly desired objective. These individuals are extremely egocentric and typically meet some, but not full criteria for psychopathy. Such killers might stage aspects of crime scenes, fabricate details, or intentionally injure themselves to mislead authorities, and there may be little to no subsequent remorse, which I think pretty much sums up that situation.
Yeah,
If there is full psychopathy, Category 11, like a full-blown psychopath, you go with the higher number, right? I always talk, by the way, about Lizzie Borden, and I place Lizzie Borden in exactly the same category as Susan Smith, as a Category 10. And remember, there was that same staging, right? Someone broke in, they killed my stepmom and my dad. There was no robbery, there's no justification. They totally mutilated them in an unnecessary way. Yes, it's true, I become rich and benefit, but it wasn't I who killed them. And everyone had sympathy for her, felt that a woman of her respectability could never have killed her own family members. And there was the question of her own abuse. So that I place her right in that same category of this type of person. But when you start getting into gang members that eliminate witnesses, and you start getting more into full-blown psychopaths in Category 11, these people are a little bit more in the borderline narcissistic, antisocial camp, what we call cluster B. Wouldn't you say, Victor? Sounds like that would be the personality camp into which a lot of these people would fall.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I have seen some of those folks argue on cluster C traits with dependent personality, things like that. But
dependent features.
Yeah, but I agree that the B probably overwhelms the cluster C.
See, we had great fun just a couple of minutes ago, and everybody, I think we all understand that, in order to be in this business, as long as everybody has on these panels, you've got to have a great sense of humor simultaneously, or, you can't laugh at yourself and or the things around you. It could get very difficult pretty fast. And so we're always grateful that you folks who follow us and chime in also get that sense of humor, and quite frankly, that you have it as well. We sure appreciate you. So let's talk about a little bit about Lori Vallow. I mean, she's convicted of murder. She was brought recently extradited to Arizona from the prison in Idaho. 4 deputies brought her back in an 18-hour trip, and man, I've been on those trips, and let me tell you, typically, if we used to fly them back, we'd be the first ones on the plane, and they'd put us at the very back row in an aircraft. So if you ever get on a plane and there's already 3 people sitting in the back when you're boarding, high probability that individual has been chased down, captured, and are shipped back, and so that's when we used to fly domestic. And so in this case, they drove her over, and now she's currently being held at Maricopa County Jail. She now faces 2 other murder conspiracy charges after leaving a trail of death that started here in Arizona and then multiplied itself over into Idaho, where her 2 children were also murdered by her estranged husband and herself. She's accused of conspiring in the fatal shooting of her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, in Chandler, Arizona, and she's also accused of planning the attempted murder of Brandon Bardeau, the ex-husband of Lori's niece, in Gilbert, Arizona. In those shootings, which happened in 2019, Lori's now deceased brother, Alex Cox, was the suspect, but he was following his sister's charge that each of them were so-called dark spirits. So this has a little cult concept to it of some sort, meaning, not necessarily, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe this thing, to be honest with you, because the first one goes down here with Charles in Chandler, and then she takes off with, Chad, her estranged husband. But then they have this really strange religious disconnect with the world, for lack of a better term, where they start seeing everybody around them as either a number and or a dark or a light spirit. And the dark spirits needed to be exterminated, enter her 2 children. It was real doomsday stuff. What's going on with the mental side of this? She was put into a facility. Ann, you want to start with you?
Well, I wonder, how old were the children?
7.
Do you have the age?
7 and 16, and the 7-year-old was autistic, killed with a plastic bag over the head with duct tape, asphyxiated, and the female is killed by unspecified means, but not necessary for that degree of cruelty. Getting back to that original point, right, of the overkill, the overboard elements. But yeah, that was the situation. And but Ann, what do you think?
What do I think? Well, I think that falls more into your category of elimination, that they're in the way, evidently, of the relationship with this Chad. And they were going to, they blamed it on the dark spirits. That was one way to get away with it. And then did they have some fantasy whether they're going to be together and ride off into the sunset or something?
Well, that's
Yeah.
what the prosecutors said, that it was that the children were obstacles. That was which
Yeah,
fall right
yeah,
into the
okay.
elimination point. And then all
Right.
these other things start coming in, but she was somebody, I think, who craved money and power and,
Right.
freedom
More
and all that.
psychopathic,
And
sure.
yeah, and I think,
Yeah.
you start thinking about category 11 here in the scale, or
Yeah,
10.
I guess
Yeah, that we
that'd
just
be your
talked
limit.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, given that we study asphyxiation, I mean, the special needs child with the plastic bag over the head with duct tape to ensure, that he's really going to die.
Well, remember that heiress just did that?
Yeah.
She killed her autistic child, 9 years old. And she was held for years down in New York. And then I see where she committed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen that before. I mean, we've seen that before. That it sounds like they could have been different motives for the two children. A 16-year-old is obviously very. That's an unusual age. And then
the 16-year-old was dismembered.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay.
it was a horrific situation.
Yeah.
And Dr. Petreca, that's kind of right up your lane. Don't you study that lane?
Yeah, and we have written a few papers on the topic of dismemberment and mutilation, and one of them was actually comparing females who dismember their victims versus male who have committed the same type of crime. And generally, women fall in two groups. You either have those who are very disorganized, they are mentally ill, they are psychotic, and the crime is consistent with it, right? So sometimes they may consume raw flesh, they have very all over the place type of patterns. And the other group is the very practical, that they will, I guess the stereotypical is they'll kill the husband, chop him, put in a suitcase so she can escape with the new lover, or the children who are impeding her progress in a relationship, so we'll kill them, dismemberment, and dispose. More that disposal type of rationale behind it. So those are the two most prevalent, right? Of course, you can have other variations within it, but statistically, we would be first looking into one of those two. Is this someone who was very mentally ill and very chaotic, or someone who was very practical and dismembering with the intent of hiding evidence?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because now the husband is going to go on trial. I wonder if the defense will use any of what you just said as a tool for defense. What do you think?
I suspect, well, generally speaking, when you have those extreme forms of violence, people at least entertain the idea, right? Because when you have dismemberment, mutilation, cannibalism, many of those sorts, this person must have been crazy, but not always, right? It's not always something that's associated with, let's say, someone who was high on methamphetamine, or someone who has an acute psychotic episode. It could be someone who perhaps has just very practical, psychopathic tendencies that could be involved in that type of crime. So I suspect that they will go in the direction. But what I will be thinking in this case in particular, you have a 16-year-old, right? So before the 16-year-old is dismemberment, he has to be killed. And if you have a woman and a 16-year-old, was this a one-person murder? That would be one of my first questions. Was there some type of, influence from other people? And we have seen categories of crimes committed by women. Perhaps I'm thinking more so of sexually motivated crimes, which might not be relevant here. But in any case, in which a woman is more following someone else's plan, right? So there is a mastermind, for lack of a better term, behind the crime, and the woman's more the executioner of it.
Yeah. Do you feel, Gary or Ann, that they could lean on what Victor is talking about for Chad's defense? Because he comes up next for trial, and she's going to go on trial here in Arizona for killing her ex-husband. Well, he's going to probably go on for the killing of the two children in his backyard in Idaho.
Do you know what Victor just asked of what order were they killed in? Was it all in one day, or different days, or?
Yeah, It was all this around the same time, yeah.
Same day.
But
And who was first? Who was the most threat?
the children were killed last. So we have
Right, that makes sense. So who was killed first?
the ex-husband.
So the male was killed first. That makes sense. He's the most.
And then his wife was taken out. Chad's wife was taken out, and then the children.
Yeah. Then the children. Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of people in the chat talking about all these bizarre, apocalyptic ideas and things, that this person, zombies and all this craziness. And but I think it's important to bear in mind that when we talk about something like not guilty by reason of insanity, what we're really talking about is, did the person appreciate the difference between right and wrong? Did they know what they were doing at the time? And even if a person is influenced by ideas like that, this is somebody who methodically, knew what they were doing. I mean, even Victor, wouldn't you say even the butchery of the body is an organized thing to do because it was done to hide or eliminate evidence?
No, that's a good point. And I have worked with quite a few cases in which the perpetrator had bona fide mental illness. No question this was a person who was mentally ill, but that in itself is not sufficient for an insanity defense. That a person being mentally ill does not equate being insane, right? Someone who's mentally ill may still understand right from wrong. And in an attempt to hide evidence, that's usually what the prosecution will go for, to try to debunk the angle from the defense.
So we're not discounting whether there was any bona fide or made up mental illness stuff, because it really doesn't get to the question of, was this premeditated and was this, overly cruel, etc. Because I'm very stuck on how unnecessarily awful the murder was of the 7-year-old, for example.
Yeah, so I may have misspoken here. I want to make sure we get the order correctly. And thank you, everybody, for correcting me. It was the husband first, then the Tylee, the teenager, and then JJ, the autistic young man, and then Chad's wife. I'm sorry, I screwed that up. So thank you for correcting me, everybody.
But they're still close enough in time that, depending upon which definition one uses, I mean, this might not be someone who potentially is a serial killer, because it depends on the length of time one uses to describe a cooling off period. Right. So, like, for example, in my own work, when I look at mass murder and spree murder and all that, I use 1 month as a cooling off period. Right. But other people might say cooling off period is 2 weeks or whatever. So depending upon that, you have to ask yourself, was there a cooling off period, or is this somebody that was sort of on a spree for a few weeks? And the trouble is, we need a clean definition of cooling off period in the literature to be able to answer that question, because these kinds of cases confuse you when you're asking that question. Because if it is someone who falls into the serial killer category, then there's a very high likelihood of reoffending if released, because serial killers are motivated by things that are going to cause them to keep playing things out over and over again, right? Whether they're pragmatic and financial or fantasy oriented or sexual or whatever. But if somebody goes on a spree, that's a very different type of person, right? So we have to it's complicated, because unfortunately the definitions that currently exist are problematic for this type of case.
Have you guys ever seen anything like this? Because, where does Lori fall into this? Because, if she's killing her ex-husband or having him killed by her brother, Alex at the time, but she's there, but she left, that morning. She ran the kids allegedly to school, which is all a bunch of, hogwash. They went to I think a Burger King, and then it's the kids. She's helping assist the murder of her own children. And then her brother gets taken out after that. Is she a spree? Is she part of a spree? Is she a serial? What's she building into here?
Right. The time frame makes it complicated, because you're talking about it's all under a month. If you define a spree as where there's no cooling off period, what's a cooling off period? The literature is not clear. So I just came up with a month, but other people might say it's less. So, is a break of a week enough to make you a serial killer? But I would say generally serial killers, the offenses are going to have a cooling off period of at least a month between the offenses. Of course, we've got Ann here, who is one of the authors of the crime classification manual. I think we should ask her. But Ann, wouldn't you say at least a month for a cooling off period? No?
Oh, yes, it can be even more than that. And usually, don't forget, we were looking at how long does the fantasy last before they have to go and get someone else. So you don't know whether that's even at play here. So now these 4 people were not killed all in the same day.
Right. Allegedly,
that was,
by the way, allegedly,
they would be
found guilty of the other.
Yeah, because that would be mass. That would be mass murder.
If they were all at the same time in the same place,
right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And then you've got this other thing that makes this case really interesting is this use of a partner, that this
right.
collaboration with someone else, which is kind of unusual. But when you see female offenders that engage with a partner, it's interesting when you study that, the way that they can form this kind of perverse alliance. And, and sometimes it's just pragmatic, like I need someone who is physically stronger than I am to lift the body and butcher it and things like that. Victor, didn't we look at cases like that where the physical strength of the person figures in, right? Because dismemberment is not easy.
Yeah, definitely. And when you're looking into the couple, usually male female, you have not only the physical part of it, but then the role of the woman, right? The women may be used to lure the victim, or may be used to keep the one victim calm as the other one is being killed or whatnot. So, but it's a fact that the action of dismembering a body is extremely difficult and time consuming if someone doesn't have a sense, right? So I think those things have to be taken into account when you're looking in cases that involve dismemberment, especially if it's, and I'm sorry, I don't know, this in this case was only one of the victims dismembered or more than one?
The girl is the only one, I think, right, Chris?
Yes, my understanding, just Tylee.
Yeah. And when someone is dismembered, the other thing that I'll be thinking of, what was the instrument that was used to dismember? Was that available already at the scene, or was there a period between the murder and the dismemberment? Because in one of our studies, that was the key question, if there were 2 separate patterns between the murder and the dismemberment itself, because there are situations in which a person may murder the victim and they'll come back a week later to dismember, clean the scene, and dispose of the evidence. And sometimes you can have the exact opposite, that the dismemberment starts before the person is even killed.
Yeah, I think we're going to find that out in Chad Daybell's trial, because my guess is the defense is going to push it all on Alex, who's deceased, that he's the bad guy. He did everything. And, he's going to have no knowledge of what happened other than the 2 children are in his backyard in his fire pit.
Well, Chris, to answer Victor's question, the medical examiner said that it looked like Tylee was butchered using a machete-like or cleaver-like kind of tool. I sort of wonder, is it something you'd have sitting around the house, that you would just pick up and use? I mean, it sounds like somebody went out of their way to acquire an instrument that would be used for this purpose. I mean, I don't know what Ann and Victor think, but I don't have this thing sitting here. I mean, do you? I mean, that kind of tool.
Shedding my house.
I'm fresh out of those weapons myself. You heard one of my plaques just fall off the wall. I'm putting my wall of shame together behind me, and apparently I'm not doing a good job, because you just heard it hit the floor while we were.
Is that your cleaver, Chris?
Yeah. Well, he was talking about things, being apart, and that thing just fell off the wall. It's like,
zombies coming in the house.
Maybe a zombie. Something's coming. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's go over to Gypsy Rose Blanchard. And we've got. I put a poll up tonight, by the way, for whether Susan Smith should be eligible for parole in 2024. I was going to be curious to see what everybody says. I'll have those results after the show, but. So Gypsy Rose Blanchard, she pleads guilty 2016 to murdering her mom, Dee Dee Blanchard. Dee Dee had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental condition which someone makes someone ill or the illusion of being ill in order to garner attention. She'll be up for parole in a couple of weeks, actually December 28th. And she was sentenced to 10 years for killing her mother in a case with extremely bizarre circumstances. And I know, Gary, you're very well versed in this one, as well as Dr. Petreca and Dr. Burgess. But what say you about this one?
Talking to me or to
Yeah, Gary, we'll start with you.
Wow, I mean, what is that? This is one of these stories that you couldn't make up. I mean, it's an unbelievable story. I mean, you remember how it gripped the country at the time, but it essentially involved this very peculiar mother who, to the outside world, looked like the mother of the year, like a kind of a Stella Dallas, long-suffering mother that adored her child, that had supposedly had some kind of genetic illness, and was bald and unable to walk and so forth. But it was all being perpetrated on purpose. Like the head was being shaved, the child was being told to stay in the chair, etc., and was undergoing all kinds of unnecessary medical procedures, being starved, all of that, all for the attention that this mother was receiving for being such a terrific mother to this child who was ill. And what eventually happened is the child was being totally isolated from the world, in this kind of, Kathy Bates misery kind of way, right, where you don't want the world to leak in. And she eventually gets a guy on a Christian dating site to agree to kill the mother. And she goes into the bathroom, plugs her ears to not hear the mother screaming, and the man stabs her mother to death. And then they leave the body there for days, and they just go out together like they're going to have a future together. And she posts, Gypsy posts on Facebook, on her mother's Facebook, I think, something, about the mother being dead with curse word. And, the bee is dead or something like that. And so the idea being that she said later that she wanted her mother discovered. This was one of these cases that I talk about in the New Evil, where you even start to see sympathy from the public, where they see the person as a hero for killing or getting rid of a person who abused them. So it gets very complicated. And this is somebody who is up for parole. And I wonder how these things are going to factor in, that she was, somebody who had her entire, much of her life robbed from her by this very deeply, deeply disturbed mother. So these Munchausen cases are very rare. I just saw a study that said that 90% of cases involve females. It's very rare to see a male case. So it's typically a mother doing this to her child. But I have rarely heard of a case as extreme and as long-term. And let us bear in mind, just in case anybody believes this woman actually believed her daughter was sick, remember that she would do things like pick up and move when somebody would ask questions, right? Because the illusion had to be maintained at all times. She, was even collecting money from like charities. The kid was sent to Disney World, the being pushed around in the wheelchair, the whole thing. Everyone had sympathy. Really an awful case. I have to say, it's hard for me, even when I think about the morality of it. So I wonder what other people think. But it was an extreme case of abuse.
Well, I think for the record, go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, go ahead, please, Ann. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm just going to say these are terrible cases for healthcare workers, because they're put into an awful position of, is this really true? They try to treat the child. I think they even can get sued. Did I read in this case that there is a suit against one of the doctors for doing whatever? So I have great sympathy for the healthcare group that has to make a decision on that. Let alone, so I just wanted to put it there that people take complaints and symptoms very seriously and want to try to relieve the symptoms of the person and try to do their best. And then when it turns out to be a Munchausen, it's, I think they've even changed the classification. I think they call it something else now. Victor, you probably...
Yeah, they had. So now the DSM, the diagnostic manual, calls it a factitious disorder, and it can be imposed on self or by proxy.
Right.
And in my career, I've evaluated, it's not that often that I come across. Just for context, I've been evaluating offenders for over 10 years. So I have done 10,000 plus, and I've had 4 factitious disorder by proxy people who I've evaluated. And one thing that was always, it was clear that they were so disturbed themselves that psychologically those were very complicated individuals. But of course, in this case, you have another person who is directly victimized or suffering because of their own psychological disturbances. And it's almost this blind need for attention or almost pity. It doesn't matter what type or the quality of attention, but they are just such needy individuals that they will go to this extent of really harming not only the person, right, in this case, the child, but also, as Anne points out, the system. That I have consulted in cases for the other side too. And now you have all these medical providers who were ordering and doing procedures and all this type of stuff. And now they are being accused of malpractice because they were kind of just going along with all these issues that the other person with the factitious disorder or the Munchausen syndrome was just bringing into play. And it's such an uncomfortable situation all around for the team. And from evaluator or caregiving side, it's such guilt, right, that nurses and physicians and everybody carries, because everybody questions, how didn't I see it? But I can tell you one case that I saw. It was this one child that nothing helped the infections that they were having. They were hospitalized, they were in the ICU, and nothing could get rid of the blood poisoning or infection that they had, right? They had septicemia. And it turned out that every time that the mother had a moment with the child, she would inject fecal matter in the IV line. So, of course, the child was never getting cured. But it was terrible, right? Because everybody, how didn't we catch the tiny little holes in the IV bag and whatnot? So now, in this case, you have Gypsy, right? Who, of all the victims in the situation, she was the main victim who could have died. The cases that I've dealt with, the child didn't survive. The child actually died because of the continuation of the person, of the guardian there. So morally, ethically, it's one of those that bring the question, right? What about Gypsy?
Well, because I think that it comes very close to the construct of self-defense when you think about what Gypsy did to eliminate this person. And obviously, the court didn't see it that way. They saw it that this was, calculated and kind of cold-blooded, perhaps. But it gets really difficult. Like, for example, I Michael Stone and I think about these cases as being, I'm talking about Dee Dee, as being cases that basically involve extreme narcissism, right? Where you're attention seeking and you really don't care about the needs of another human being. And, that's sort of how we think about those Munchausen's kind of cases, by proxy cases. And, but there are cases of people that are severely abused that eliminate their abusers, and the public applauds them sometimes. For example, there's a case involving 3 sisters, the Khachaturian case. It's very interesting to me. They were all being systematically abused by their father, and they made a pact that they were going to put a pillow over his head while he slept, and one was going to kill him with a hammer, and the other ones were going to do whatever they were going to do to get rid of him. And they escaped an absolutely horrendous man who was, systematically abusing them all. And in, I believe it's Russia, there are calls for their release. The public sees them as heroes. And so that those cases, we put Gypsy, probably into category 5 in the scale, where people act out of these traumatic needs. And what happens in those cases is they don't generally ever kill again. They're not killers. They just are under horrendous circumstances. So that's why I think Parole in her situation is a very different animal than a Susan Smith situation, because that was situational, but of course there are features there like colluding with a boyfriend and getting the boyfriend to do it that you start wondering, is it a little more than just defending oneself. So I mean, that sounds like a question for you, Victor.
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. And I think that just to add, there's definitely some narcissistic flavors that I see in those folks, but the ones that I at least have dealt with, the histrionics, well, speaks really loud.
Oh,
Those
yeah.
folks are such histrionic personalities.
Acting, yeah.
Yeah, with a dash of borderline tendencies too, right? So it's, again, the cluster B sampler, as I like to call, with an extra dose of histrionics. But the question that is challenging here, right, is that in the court of law is like, is everybody agrees that Gypsy was victimized? Yes, I don't think that's the problem, right? But then the question is, could have Gypsy reacted in other ways? And that's where the defense or the prosecution, that's where they are going to zero in, right? They're going to start talking about, oh, but she tried to find someone to do it, she planned, and all of that. And that's where I guess the morality of the whole thing really becomes challenging, right? And I don't think it's unusual. I have dealt with quite a few cases. The one that jumps in my mind is I dealt with a case who had her boyfriend actively assaulting sexually her child, and she stabbed the guy to death. And she got hit so hard with a sentence, you know. And most people, when they hear the crime, they'll be like, she should have stabbed him even more, you know. So, but to Gary's point, someone like Gypsy, I wouldn't particularly concerned about her offending again, you know. So those things will be taken into account when she for parole.
Right. Although the colluding with the boyfriend is
that is
taken into consideration. Yeah.
Well, for sure. And I think that is what makes the whole thing, because you mentioned it's self-defense-esque, right? Yeah.
Self-defense-esque. That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
I can see that. But then there's, I guess the legal system is also thinking about fairness, right, of punishment. And there's the planning and all of those things that came into play as well. So it's tricky.
You know, what's interesting, it's always interesting that you get a victim who is a real victim, and they're just beaten down to the point where it seems like in their mind that homicide, it seems like the only way out.
Yeah. But Chris, that is very common with what we don't use this terminology of the battered women syndrome anymore, right? Because there's some controversy, but that approach has been used several times for cases of domestic violence in which the women are broken down in the domestic violence or the narcissistic circle with the perpetrator, and eventually they lash out, right? And essentially they fight back. And I can recall many cases in which the defense doesn't really stick. The victim who became the perpetrator is often sentenced and found guilty because it wasn't in the heat of the moment. You know, I think that if Gypsy had killed her mom in the heat of the moment, then it could have been a different story.
Yeah, it would have been a manslaughter, maybe, right? Because of the passion. I had one case years ago. It was a very horrific essay, and it involved, believe it or not, he was he was an agent, FBI agent in San Diego, and his wife, they got into a domestic. They split up for the evening. She took the 3 kids, her daughter, and to her 2 other children, and they went to a hotel for the evening. Long story short, an offender broke into the hotel and just brutally essayed her in front of the daughter, and actually said some things to the daughter that I won't repeat here on YouTube, but it was just horrific. And they had her down at Scripps La Jolla at the SART team was in there, and the husband showed up, and he said to me, he says, I want to go in, I'm going to talk to my wife. And I said, well, unfortunately you can't right now. She's in there with the SART team. And that's, for those of you that don't know that, it's Sexual Assault Response Team. Anyway, they were doing what, Ann, you've been studying and teaching for, quite some time. They were doing their thing, right? Yeah. And trying to get her into a place where she was safe and, you know, feeling right. And the guy says to me, he goes, well, I'm going to go in there. And I said, well, no, you're not. You're not going in there. I'm sorry. So I tried to get the docs, you know, to tune him up a little bit. That didn't work. And so they were finally done with the exam. And he says to me, he says, look, that's my wife. I'm going in. And I said, well, I'm going with you. And he gets through the door. And the first thing out of his mouth was, what did you get yourself into tonight? I went nuts. Okay. And I thought to myself, that's some insight into some things that none of us knew, the totality of these circumstances. And I wonder, what more do we not know about this gypsy and her circumstances? I mean, it seems like it was a horrific life, and that her options were very limited. Is it any different than the guy on the phone, Gary, going by, who we had recently? His father reaches out and shoots him while he's getting off the.
You mean when we had Jody on?
Jody, yeah.
You mean in the sense that the father felt that desperate circumstances drove him to shoot the attacker of his child?
Yes.
I mean, I think, you know, again, it gets right to this quality of what happens when a person feels helpless and overwhelmed emotionally. I mean, there can be a little of this plotting, you know, to kind of eliminate the person, but there is, the key to it is that the person feels there's no other mechanism. And you know, but the other thing I think is interesting, and when Michael and I looked at this for category 5 in the new evil, these people that kill out of desperation, we found that there tends to be overkill because there's an expression of all the pent up rage and frustration and anger and sadness and everything else that you felt during this period of being helpless. So, or it can even be that you had previously been abused and now you're involved in a relationship where it's replicated, and it comes out in an absolute frenzy, an absolute explosion, so that you can see things like somebody stabbed, you know, 125 times, you know, absolutely outrageous. And, you know, you remember when, you know, the behavioral science unit started looking at, you know, for profiling reasons, they started looking at domestic offenses. And one of the things they learned was that when you see extreme butchery, particularly of faces of people, you start thinking this is domestic. This is somebody with pent up rage towards someone they intimately know. I mean, Anne, isn't that true? Yeah.
Oh, that is true. Yeah, I don't think people really appreciate how much anger it builds up in somebody who's been repeatedly pushed down or beaten down psychologically. Doesn't have to be physical. And that comes out. And I think that's exactly what you're saying is, and even in the Jody case, I remember hearing about the father, they become very focused, everything narrows, and the intent, the mission, if you will, is to get the anger out, get the revenge out, whatever. And those are the dynamics. And it's very hard to get that across sometimes to a jury that, you know, and there's a physiological, I think we totally underestimate how our body reacts, how the to quote Bessel van der Kolk, how the body keeps score. You know, so I agree with everything. Yeah.
I think you bring a good point up, and that you're talking about how the pent-up anger comes out and in revenge. And I think that's where the jury gets confused, or it becomes the challenge, right? Because was this the pent-up anger and one trying to free themselves, or was this an act of getting even or punishing back or revenge? And it's tricky, right? Because those are not mutually exclusive. It could be both.
You have to be very careful if you're talking about that in court. Absolutely, for that reason. You just don't know how that jury is going to react. So I tend to not play it up. I rather see it, try to make people understand of just the physiology of the autonomic nervous system or something like that, that it automatically kicks in. Whatever the reaction is, rather than labeling it as anger or revenge. Yeah.
And wasn't there that overkill element in the Menendez case where there was a question of abuse also?
Yes.
Hmm.
Because well, the shotguns. First of all, picking what a weapon to pick to shoot someone. But I use the analogy of a bee. People get very scared of this little tiny insect, and they hit and they hit and they swat. You know, that's an overkill for. Yeah, and spiders or things that are so tiny, and yet they just overwhelm the biggest people.
I hate bees and spiders.
Really?
Oh my goodness!
You've dealt with some of the worst offenders in the history of mankind.
I handle a bee. You know, when I was a kid, I had a bee land on my hamburger, and I took a bite, and the bee stung me in my mouth, and I remember it to this day. I do not like bees, but you know, shifting back to Gypsy, where does she fit in your book? Gary, do you want to? Can you read something out of your book on that one?
Gypsy,
Let's see what you got there.
Gypsy, right? The one who
Gypsy. Because
I'll read it to you.
It seems like our panel here, or excuse me, the chat here, they're 50-50 on her. Just listening to your insight about the connecting here.
Yeah,
and so it's interesting. It's interesting.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about Gypsy, not Dee Dee, you're talking about Gypsy.
Gypsy.
I think she's category 5, and it says individuals in category 5 who show no signs of psychopathy feel driven to homicide by traumatic or desperate circumstances, followed by bona fide guilt and remorse. These killings are generally impulsive without much deliberation. The victims are typically family members or significant others, but other people perceived as contributing to the individual's negative circumstances might be targeted. Looking over a variety of cases classified here, we note that the emotions involved are more often than not about a sense of weakness or helplessness arising due to the convergence of two forces. First, there is some external problem, such as aggression or maltreatment by a spouse partner, financial difficulties, or some other adverse condition in the home. And second, and this is very interesting, there is a psychological factor such as intense anxiety, trauma related to prior abuse, or profound depression, sometimes even with transient psychotic thinking. And the individual consequently feels hopeless, lost, and driven over the proverbial edge before a period of returning to his or her baseline level of functioning. We also note that homicides of this type could sometimes be especially violent in intensity, as if the individual has focused long pent-up hurt, resentment, and frustration into one explosive emotional expression. So I think that's exactly what we saw in this case. I think that if I were looking at this case, it sounds like Victor and Ann agree, there'd be a very careful weighing of, if there are elements here that make this a little bit more premeditated and calculated, or etc. I mean, wouldn't you say, Ann and Victor? I mean, we can't say just at a snapshot way here, but the impetus does seem to be an outrageous history of abuse. I mean, let's face it, her life was stolen from her. I mean, much of her entire youth was stolen from her by this woman. And you know what's fascinating? She told, I think it was Dr. Phil. She told Dr. Phil that she's sorry her mother's dead. She said she wanted the abuse to stop, but she wishes her mother was not dead. And there, I think we see the contrition and the attachment to an abuser that you would expect to see in somebody who is not a psychopath. It's this is a victimized person. I mean, and Victor, wouldn't you say that that contrition and that missing the person are typical of abused people who eliminate their abusers, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So sad. That's such a sad case. I can't stand it. Yeah.
Well, that was a heavy one, obviously, to kind of sink towards the end here. But let's see if anybody has any question of our panel here. We got about another 12 minutes, and we'd love to have some of your questions pop up here, and I'll put them up for the doctors. This is always, I don't know about you guys out there, but this is always feel like a master class, times 10.
Especially with these two.
Well, the three of you, I mean, this is, I've been in this business since 1982, and you know, I have a case right now that I can't really go into a lot of details about it, but it's just sad. It's sad that it even got to the place that it did and somebody passed away. But, you know, it's amazing. So let's see here. Do we have a thought? Okay, I don't know this particular case, and maybe somebody here does. Anybody know the Aiden Lucy case? Gary, you're going to look in your...
No. I know that's the case where the guy, when he was 14 years old, like massively overkilled, you know, the girl that he felt rejected by. I mean, it was absolute brutality, like top to bottom. But this is not, you know, one of these things where somebody says, like, I'm terribly sorry, you know, I didn't know what I was doing, I was overwhelmed or whatever. This was more like a leveling the playing field because of feelings of rejection thing. You certainly do see that extreme overkill, like totally unnecessary overkill, in that case. And that's the kind of person I'd worry about if they were ever back out in the world, you know, anger towards women, you know, the willingness to kill in that overly violent way. But what you see there is somebody who got super hot, who walked around with a kind of chip on his shoulder and was hot-headed, and then sort of felt slighted and felt the need to do that, to kind of get even like that. But that case is horrifying. I mean, absolutely horrifying. The number of stabs. I can look in my database here and see how many stabs it was, but it was pretty incredible.
Yeah.
But he was only a kid. I think from memory it was over 100 stabs, if I remember correctly.
It was 110 or something like that.
Yeah, and he was 14. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. But you know, the topic of kids who kill is also a topic of great interest to me, and it's another one of these new evils that is increasing. I mean, you could literally look at like a century of data from the 19th century, and you'll be able to count on one hand the child killers like Jesse Pomeroy and a couple of these people. But then you start getting into the later years of the last century into now, and you see this increase of kids that kill. And it is absolutely unbelievable, but I have no doubt it's cultural in nature. But yes, extreme overkill because of feelings of humiliation, rejection, and anger, particularly towards females, I think was definitely played out there. No question.
Do you think Gypsy has potential to be a good mother?
Gypsy, not Dee Dee.
Not Dee Dee.
Gypsy.
Yeah. Okay.
Gypsy.
Yeah.
Well, we know she didn't have any positive mothering from Dee Dee. So you have to ask, is there anyone that she has had some positive maternal kinds of experiences? It's.
Let's see here.
Well, I would be curious if Gypsy even wants to be a mom. That would be what I.
Well, that's true. Right.
Here's a reverse. This is a good one. Why are so many men enamored and risking everything for Susan Smith? We always talk about that from the other side, but you know, because Koberger and Murdoch are getting all these love letters, but it seems the opposite here. What's going on with the guys?
Yeah.
I mean, it's still hybristophilia. It's still an attraction to a person that is associated with having killed. I mean, perhaps it has something to do with the fact that you have a damsel in distress type that pulls for a man who comes along and says, I'll take care of you, honey. You know, that kind of thing. I mean, it may pull for that kind of fantasy in the same way that with the females with hybristophilia, there tends to be, this idea of you're going to protect me. Because you're strong enough to like mutilate people. You're going to protect me because I'm different than the victims. I'm special, or something like you're in a cage, you're not going to cheat on me. You're never going to leave me. I never have to consummate this. So you're the perfect person to have a relationship with. But I think that there is something in the personality of these people that is incredibly charming and powerful, and and it pulls for this thing. I mean, even from a jail cell, she's pulling for what she did out in the world with this thing of rescue me, love me, be the knight in shining armor that comes in. So I just think, to me, it's a reflection of her personality organization, that you get these men who have a certain type of personality that mimics. I'd be interested to know how old the men are that are proposing, given the relationship she had with the stepfather and all of that. She seems to want a dad, perhaps, and I wouldn't be shocked if some of these men are significantly older.
Yeah, she's got.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Victor.
I also would probably presume that some of these men, they struggle with developing romantic relationships with women otherwise. So having someone who is just reciprocating their advances may be the draw.
Interesting. So this is kind of a maybe a loaded question, but is there any? I'm going to kind of reframe this. Is there any research going on, if you're aware of it, where video games are desensitizing children to violence?
Yes. There's been research since the 90s, I think. And yes, it does. Yes, it does. They're looking at that as anything that's visual and has the power to entice and so forth. Yes, can be very dangerous. We know, right? That's what we see it.
Yeah, the APA has gone back and forth on the recommendations when it comes to video games, because there's research. It's one of those, right, that we haven't been able to demonstrate causal relationships, but we have seen associations between the consumption of anything that's extreme, whether it is video games or videos of a sexual nature or whatnot, and then the behaviors that people engaging, and probably because of the desensitization, right? That if you are dealing with this avatar that is doing certain things out in the world, and if you have no other frame of reference, would that potentially make you a little more susceptible?
Well, yeah, you know what's interesting about that? Go ahead, Gary.
Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Well, I mean, they train soldiers on video games, and they train pilots on video games for muscle memory. And so if you play it long enough and do it long enough, then your muscle memory will be there. Go ahead, Victor.
Well, I was going to say, your brain doesn't know the difference. Your brain doesn't know the difference. That's part of the danger with, like, the metaverse, for example. And if we understand that addictive behaviors, require that process of kind of like, having a stimulus that then is not enough and then needing to escalate. And then you think about a person who's on a violence trajectory towards something like sexual assaults, homicide, mass murder, etc. It may be that there's excitement, arousal to the central nervous system through what your brain thinks is really shooting people or really committing sexual acts vicariously through pornography. And then it's not enough, that there's that need to spill over. The trouble is that the research is equivocal. And, you open up a can of worms when you start saying that kids can get desensitized by things like that. And then, how causal was that? For example, in the Adam Lanza case, Adam Lanza was highly addicted to violent video games. And in fact, in fact, in the Lanza case, one of the ideas that came up is that part of the reason he targeted children in the the Sandy Hook case was that he had this idea from video games that if someone killed you, they took the points that you had racked up in the video game, right? So the idea is, I want to rack up as many kills as I can quickly and then take myself out so that that's my high score that can't be taken from someone else. So that the idea was to target children so that he could rack up a body count quickly and then eliminate himself. And, this is highly disturbing, but unfortunately, if we want to understand these offenses, we've got to step into the minds of these people. And, that was a person who was very influenced by video game thinking, right? In fact, he kept a score sheet of mass shooters to say, like, where would I be in the lineup, right? He had that. He kept a spreadsheet.
So he kept himself almost like a
spreadsheet of victim counts of mass murderers.
Wow.
If I remember correctly, a 9-point font, which you would print out and keep on so it was like a score sheet. So you have to understand somebody who's thinking like a video game, where fantasy is bled into reality in a scary way, right?
But Gary, I would probably expand it to violent media in general, right? Because if you look at Magnotta essentially recreating what is the Basic Instinct or whatever the Sharon Stone movie was. So I think there is something to, and it's a tricky one again, right? Because if you have vulnerable individuals who are consuming that type of media, it may trigger something in them, but the hundreds of millions of people consuming all those things and don't engage, right? So where is there's where the research struggles.
I was going to say, what's the tipping point, right? To your point, Victor, Dr. Petreca. I mean, where does the research go? I mean,
well, you never know what the mitigating factors are, and what pulls the other way. You never can measure all of that. So there will always be, I think.
That's true. And I think that's also something that we are looking into with our working threat assessment and research, trying to identify the pathway to violence, right? What are the different intercept points in which we can identify different factors that we can potentially screen for, and if they trigger positive, then we can have an intervention that follows through. And well, I didn't even think about this before. In our research that we are doing, video games pop up very frequently as one of the, I don't know if it's a risk factor or not, but it's a factor that it's there, there's a high consumption of it. So,
let's just say I don't think an IRB is going to want to receive an application that says we're going to have a control group, and an experimental group where they're both going to watch video games, and we're going to see who goes out and kills, to be able to see. I mean, that's the whole problem. You can't set up a study like that. We're never going to get to the bottom of it because you can't systematically study it.
I wonder, though, if you could reverse engineer it.
Yeah.
If you could reverse engineer it from soldiers returning from war and asking them, did your video experience enhance your war experience or decrease it? Meaning, were you a better soldier or, something to that effect? I know I'm talking crazy talk, but at the same time.
Question. Great question.
It is a good question, but it's still a complicated one for research, right? Because my first thought as a researcher is, well, folks who are soldiers and are enlisting, they're self-selecting into that job. So they may have a personality archetype that is different than the general population, that perhaps I can barely, if I caught myself yesterday cutting onions and I was almost fainting, look at my own blood. So I would never select myself to enlist anywhere. So for me, whether it's video games, I just can't.
Oh, you cracked me up, Victor. Oh my gosh.
Well, but I think the desensitization question is a real one, and I think there's no question it happens with pornography. I mean, and how much did it come up with the serial killers you guys studied, that pornography was fuel for people that were gradually desensitizing themselves?
We'll go Ted Bundy said.
Right.
Yeah. Ted Bundy's good example. Yeah.
I worry about these poor children that, as young as they are today, being exposed to just this horrendous plague.
Oh yeah, for sure. I have, as part of my work, I do evaluate a lot of folks who have committed sexual offenses. And so many of those cases are not what you would normally think about your violent person who is looking to prey on people, but folks that were reenacting what they have watched and not having a clue that women don't want to be choked, that they think it's so normal and to Gary's point, anything that we are talking about that is going to cause that dopamine rush will have the pattern of tolerance, right? And then to have the same response, you're going to have to escalate the dose that you are consuming. And if you're already consuming very high doses of very graphic or violent materials, then where are you going to end up? It just escalates. And unfortunately, in some cases also translates from the virtual to the real world.
Right.
Wow. Well, I've had you for 2 hours. Okay. And first of all, everybody in the chat, don't you think Dr. Petreca should be coming to the interview room much more often? Don't you believe that?
I think so.
And don't you believe I should have one of his books sitting next to me at some point going down the road here.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry to tell you, Victor, look what's happening to the chat. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So that means you're going to have to carve more time out of your schedule like Dr. Brucato and Dr. Burgess have. And we're going to have you on much more often. Did everybody in the chat, did you guys have an amazing time here tonight like I did? I'll tell you what, this was a really great intellectual conversation that I hope we help somebody out there listening. And that if in fact you yourself potentially are struggling with any type of issue, please reach out and try to get help. There's help around you, and don't lose hope. There is somebody that you can grab their hand and they will pull you in and help you. Whatever that process is, it's available to you. So now the one thing I forgot to tell Victor, seeing how he is one of the last or the most recent, he gets the last word. Dr. Burgess and Dr. Brucato, what do you think? And then, we always get that deer in the headlight look, which, wherever you want to talk about, wherever your heart goes to the audience, and we always like to leave on a positive note when you're done. Just say thank you, have a good night, and then we're going to go to Hawaii. But before we do that, I'm going to turn some time over to Dr. Burgess to talk about whatever you feel. And if you guys have not gone, again, one last plug for her book, please go pick this book up on Amazon. The link is below. And then, of course, Dr. Brucato's been reading out of his book, and I'm just tearing this thing up. As you can tell, I've got all kinds of yellow marks all over this thing. Boy. And I can't, it's a page turner as well. Both of these books are must have. And if you're in law enforcement, you need to get these books and put them in your bookshelf because they are great resources to go to trying to understand individuals that you potentially could be sitting with in the interview room. So that said, Merry Christmas to everybody coming up. Happy holidays to everyone. Happy Hanukkah, all the holidays, Kwanzaa. It's all coming at us in December. So we love you all. Diversity is a great thing, and we just need to be a lot kinder to one another as we come into the holiday season. But we got some great shows coming, so make sure you follow us coming up here. We've got John Ray coming back, and that's going to be another big one. And hey, real fast though, before I forget, sorry. Hair from the wife in the Heuermann's case on the victims, Gary?
Right. Several victims, and it turns out it was just revealed that a cheek swab showed that her DNA is on bodies, and John Ray has talked a lot about the question of whether the wife may have been involved in some way with the sexual activity, whether there was group sexual activity, swinging, etc., which of course raises the question, how much does a person know is going on? How much are they involved? Is it because they were killed in the home, etc.? No one has, to my knowledge, made any kind of accusation that she was directly involved in killing. But the question of how much she knew and how much was going on with her knowledge or how much she was participating in is now going to get very interesting. That is something that came up when we first started talking about the Heuermann case, about whether she was going to be, someone who was a victim in her own way because she didn't know her husband was doing these things. But then it started to unravel. If you listen to John Ray's story from witnesses, it starts to unravel that they were possibly participating in swinging parties and things that might have been the means by which victims were identified. And then it looks like the accusation is that perhaps Rex went beyond that activity.
Everybody, you're hearing it. So we're gonna dive into this conversation Yeah, Victor for president. No question about it. We can.
I
That's
do
great.
qualify. I'm an immigrant.
Absolutely. Come on, bring it. We love you. Okay, very interesting. So, Dr. Burgess, closing thoughts tonight, Doc.
Yeah, closing thoughts. Gee, now that you brought up the Hooverman case, I have to go to our Finland expert to see. He had said that, if you remember, that he said, I hope she's not involved. He made that very clear. So I'll have to find out. Maybe he's heard more back over in his homeland. But anyway, my closing thoughts, again, have to deal with the victims. Certainly in the Susan Smith case, you cannot look at those two little boys and not really get a terrible feeling about their lost life and so forth. But then when you look at Susan Smith and what she went through, did that have anything to do with her being able to commit such a horrific crime? So we always have to look at both sides just to get try to get some bearing on the whole case. So, and then to go to the cases that we have ongoing right now, they are horrific. And I hope that we're going to be able to get some closure to them and get some real answers to it. So that's where my thoughts are as we head into the holiday season, as Chris has reminded us, and lots of things coming up this month. So thank you, Chris, for inviting me and for sharing a little bit of the knowledge I have with you and your audience.
Dr. Burgess, we love you, and thank you so much for being here this evening, and our best to you coming up here with your book sales. Hope we can drive it to number one. Gary's, yours is apparently it's saying what? It's sold out? Are they reprinting it? What's going on here?
My guess is that because of all these appearances, the whole printing sold out. So they'll do another printing. Fine with me. I'm not. Let's hope that happens next for Anne.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Keep going. Let's make that happen, guys. Let's make that happen. Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Appreciate you very, very much. Dr. Brucato, thoughts, closing thoughts.
Well, first of all, I'm a very lucky person because I get to work all the time with Anne and Victor, and you have to understand, like, it's very rare to so dearly love the people that you do research with. I mean, it's like we really authentically have a beautiful friendship and collaboration. I mean, I think the world of them. Hopefully that's mutual. But we have this fantastic synergy and just a really lovely mutual admiration society, as they say. So that is just a great joy of my life, I have to tell you. Now, I will say that what I hope this episode did was it, first of all, demonstrated that there is a kind of silliness to clustering cases together without sophisticated, meticulous dissection of differences between them. There are a wide array of reasons why female offenders, particularly mothers, might eliminate children, everything from desperation to cold-blooded, calculated cruelty. If anybody is interested in a case that I would consider as bad as it gets, I'd say look at the Teresa Knorr case, Knorr, who is a mother that had some of her children participate in torturing two of her children to death. And that case is so horrendous that I won't even describe the details here. And that's saying a lot for me, because I will often give details. But I think in that particular case, it's unspeakable. That's a 22 on the scale. So they can get that bad. And the other thing I'll say is, think about your own mothers. A lot of us rip our hair out and say, my mother's the worst mother in the world. My mother's crazy. The truth is, as Carl Jung used to say, when your mother is cruel to you, it affects your entire worldview. Jung used to say that if you internalize the archetype of a mother in a way that she's cruel and hurts you, you'll never trust anybody in the world. That there's something about the ability to see the world as caring about you and loving you and forgiving you and all that, as taking care of you. We even say Mother Earth, right? It is going to be affected by a poor attachment with the mother figure, right? And so, think a little bit about on the worst day, many of us have mothers that do love us and would do anything for us. And finally, what I'll say is, as the holidays come up, remember the central theme of all of these very beautiful holidays is the conquering of darkness by a very small amount of light, right? And, that's really the central theme, that no matter how bad the world gets, we're reminded at the end of the year, every year, that in the end, the light will win. It conquers, right? So when we hear these horrendous stories, right, and, we have to remember that the point is that the largest amount of darkness cannot conquer a very, very tiny little amount of hope and light. And as a very beautiful reminder when we hear these horrendous stories, So I put that out there, and I thank these two and you, Chris, for being part of the light in my own life. And good night to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for your kindness. Okay, Dr. Petreca, you have the final word. We're going to step out, and this is all you.
Okay, and I thank you when we are going to Hawaii, right?
Yes, then we're going to Hawaii.
All right, well, thank you everybody for welcoming me today. I just want to circle back to our original point for a sec, and then just remember that while we were talking about extreme cases, there are a lot of kids and innocent people that die every day out of neglect or lack of access to resources. So while it's important to look at the extreme cases, we cannot forget about those who are also being hurt in more silent ways. But on a positive note, I really hope that everybody is ready for a good holiday season, whatever is the holiday of your choice or faith. I hope you spend with your family. I just got the chance to see my mom in the first time in 15 years, and don't do the same mistake that I did. See your loved ones as much as you can. And thank you. And I guess we are going to Hawaii.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away. You and me go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.